Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our first launch event for the project that I'm going to talk about a little bit at the start. So my name is Manali Desai, and I'm the principal investigator of a 3-year ESRC-funded project titled Urban Transformation and Gendered Violence in India and South Africa. We are a large cross-disciplinary team of sociologists, historians, and anthropologists collaborating across the global North and South together. The 4 co-investigators are Professor Sanjay Srivastava at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi, Dr. Nandini Guttu at Oxford, Professor Camilla Naidu at the University of Johannesburg, and Dr. Lynn Osome, also at the University of Johannesburg. Our 2 postdocs are Shannon Phillip and Garima Jaju, who are based here in Cambridge, but we are also working with a team of other postdoctoral scholars in Delhi and in Johannesburg, with a team of other NGOs and other actors on the ground, as well as the filmmaker Rangan Chakravarti and Lisa Vetton, policy advocate in Johannesburg. You can certainly look up the details of our team on the website. And just for reference, GendV is the tag that we use for following us on social media for updates of what we're doing in our project, to get regular updates, which are sent on Twitter as well as on Instagram. And of course, most importantly, on our website, our GendV website, where we also have regular blogs about the project. So what are the project's intentions? I just want to give a brief introduction to the project. Our main aim is to move towards what some have called a second wave of violence research, that is theoretically oriented, historically sensitive, and aimed at granular analyses of violent contexts. Our aim is not really just to document the what, why, and where of violence, which is of course of great importance, but to inquire into how everyday lives, perceptions, imaginings, meanings, and experiences of gendered violence are connected to the wider spatial transformations occurring in rapidly neoliberalizing contexts such as India and South Africa. So we place violence within wider transformations in the political economy of urban life and livelihoods, shifts in family forms and gender relations. And we historicize these relations by looking at the legacies of racial, ethnic, and other forms of categorization that implicate men and women in specific relations to the state and to the economy. So our project is something that is using a variety of data. We are not, we made a conscious decision really to use a mixed method approach that includes ethnography, life history interviews, archival research, audiovisual material increasingly, and the analysis of court and police records. And we felt that this mixed method approach would really give us a picture into the multiple facets of gendered violence in urban spaces in these 2 contexts. Our research sites, very briefly, and again, you can read more about this on our blog. In Johannesburg, we're focusing on Alex and Sandton. Alex is a poor township of Johannesburg with formal and informal settlements, and actually a long history of involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle. It's also adjacent to the wealthier Sandton area. So we wanted to really look at this juxtaposition and think a little bit about the ways in which race, class, and other forms of spatial configuration really affect the forms of gendered violence and responses to gendered violence in these 2 contexts. In the wider Delhi NCR, we're focusing on Gurgaon, which is a hub of international investment with spectacular malls and symbols of globalized consumption. So wealthy neighborhoods, just like in Sandton, wealthy neighborhoods and apartment complexes are hidden behind privatized security, and woven through these neighborhoods are village-like settlements, what we call peri-urban settlements, with their own caste and class configurations, many of which service the wealthy households. So once again, we're able to sort of juxtapose very different, unequal contexts to really gain some understanding into the ways in which urban space, the configuration of urban space is really affecting the forms of gendered violence and understandings and imaginings of gendered violence. Now, of course, this might be expected, and I'm sure many of you will really understand this deeply, is that the pandemic has impacted the project in ways that we, of course, were not prepared for. And many of our fieldwork plans that were in our original document had to be altered in light of the difficulties of carrying out in-person fieldwork. We are beginning in-person fieldwork, but we've also been forced to be more creative and imaginative. And I think this is actually bringing out some very interesting and new dimensions to our project. One approach that we've been taking more and more is to kind of approach violence more indirectly than we might perhaps have done before. So in Gurgaon, for example, our team is asking questions about marriage, pleasure, lifestyle patterns, love, public spaces, societal expectations, generational changes, which has revealed many fascinating insights already. So the forms, one of them, so for example, the forms of hybrid publicness that are emerging, that is to say the manner in which the public and private are being constituted shows how differently violence is understood in the two spheres or the two spaces. So while the outside is associated with threat and menace and danger, the private continues to be thought of safe and clean. And violence in the public is seen as omnipresent, as routine, even expected, and often exaggerated to phantasmic proportions. But private violence is always registered in tones of exceptionalism and surprise. We've also seen that as women increasingly express ideas of freedom and the vocabulary of feminism is gaining increasing traction and more widely circulated, when asked directly about changing gender norms, and when they reflect on everyday experiences, it becomes evident that many patriarchal ideas of good womanhood and male guardianship still prevail, even among young working women. So this is a very interesting observation that we would like to explore a little bit further. The third is, of course, a perverse trend, which is also something that we observe, is the vilified and mocked category of the over-feminist, the demanding, oversensitive, and even often cold and cruel, greedy and manipulative woman. And this is not a fringe idea that's just held by a handful of men's rights activists, for example, but an increasingly common view expressed not just by men, but also by women who are disappointed to see so many women play the victim card or manipulate the system and public sentiment to their advantage. So in Johannesburg, as our team has been doing increasingly more field work, there are some other very interesting paradoxes that are emerging when we look at the intersections of class, race, and gender. So both middle class and poorer women in Alex and Santon have talked, all of them have talked about feeling unsafe generally in the city of Johannesburg. The threats are outside in public spaces, but also articulated about threats are articulated as occurring within households and families. And so there is, in a sense, a kind of general and constant feeling of insecurity that is being expressed. Now, interestingly, what we found is because many gender-based violence programs do not necessarily reach Santon, and instead women resort to private therapists and services in these areas, middle-class women actually often lack adequate support. In particular, Black middle-class women living in urban Santon and enduring intimate partner violence are often the most dislocated and isolated and possibly even at risk of suicide. So race has been really central to our respondents' narration of their experience. Black women have often explained how if they're rich, their wealth is seen as unnatural and how often they feel discriminated in public spaces. Poorer Black women have actually talked about having to pay a quote unquote Black tax, supporting more family members and also having the added pressure and surveillance from their families. So the intersections with class produce additional complexities, and poorer women often do not get a sense of justice through formal proceedings, which makes them very reluctant to go to the police. So the theme that's really emerging from the Johannesburg side is the state's inadequate response and the narrow and limited definition of what counts as violence. The everyday presence of the post-apartheid state and the deeper history of suspicion and fear of the state sits in fascinating juxtaposition to the progressive legislation on gendered violence in South Africa, and is clearly an area demanding further detailed attention. So these themes in both spaces, the intersectional dimensions of inequality, the legacies of state rule, and the fluid political and contingent nature of the public-private distinctions are appearing, albeit in different ways in India and South Africa, but also as common themes. And as the project develops and deepens, we are aiming to flesh out these themes in greater detail. So that's a brief description about the project. I just wanted to say that, as part of the project, we're also making shorter documentary films and a long documentary film in Delhi or in Gurgaon. And we will also be, we have an artist in residence who will be producing some artistic materials. So we have a multifaceted impact case as well associated with the project. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Srimati Basu, who is a professor of gender and women's studies and anthropology, and a member of the Committee on Social Theory at the University of Kentucky. She's the author of numerous books and articles, among them The Trouble with Marriage, Feminists Confront Law and Violence was published in 2015 with the University of California Press, and her earlier book, She Comes to Take Her Rights, Indian Women, Property and Propriety, was published in 1999. Our second speaker is Professor Pumla Gqola. She's a feminist author, well known to many of you, a professor and chair in African Feminist Imagination at the Nelson Mandela University. She's author of What is Slavery to Me? Post-Colonial Slave Memory in Post-Apartheid South Africa. She's also published a renegade called Simifiwe. And finally, very relevant for our project here, Rape, a South African Nightmare, which was published in 2015 and which won the 2016 Sunday Times Alan Paton Award for Nonfiction. She has also recently published Reflecting Rogue, Inside the Mind of a Feminist. So I'm very pleased and honored to welcome both of our speakers today for our launch event. And okay, so the floor is yours now, Srimati. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon. And a big thank you to Manali for asking me to do this. And I'm so pleased to see the other people who I know who are on the project. And to Garima for communicating with me, and Ellen and Joe for taking this on. Now I'm actually today, given our previous discussion, I'm going to talk in kind of like a broader framework of how we think about gender-based violence. My apologies in advance to all the folks I'm leaving out here. Everybody's work kind of shapes how we look at this. So I'll start with these sorts of daily media headlines, right, on gender-based violence in India, the sort of the what that Manali was talking about. So you see this kind of following overdetermined narrative, right? This is just from scroll.in from last week. And here's the things you see, here's the things we actually see. The involvement of powerful men, like, gang rape comes up really often. The danger to women outside the house, the alacrity of the state in protection. So just two quick examples here. This is a member of the National Commission for Women. You can see the headline. And also just last week, the Madhya Pradesh Chief Minister, Shivraj Singh Chauhan, says a system will be put in place where a woman moving out of home for work would have to register herself at the police station. She will be tracked for her safety. So, this is this familiar, exhausting cringe. I mean, I could infinitely multiply these stories as sort of exemplars of the feminist critique of rape culture as an exercise of power that reinforces other patriarchal relations and enhances the prerogative power of the state. And in particular, one pithy headline has become this kind of synecdochic touchstone of horror of India is in this 2018, the world's most dangerous country for women, as per the Thomson Reuters study. So here we don't have to, ally with either defensive politicians or nationalists to critique this the very shaky methodology of the study of asking 548 experts, many of them journalists actually, or its use of statistics or its claim to rising rates. But we may want to better define what these dangers are and how best to talk about them. An important point here is also how the way a study such as this is framed through the colonial gaze. Chule Rakis calls it the theater of pity, something like that. Or Wendy Hesford calls it a spectacle of suffering, such that the privileges of rescue accrue to kind of feminisms in the global north, right? So in something like this, in the 2017 numbers, Cairo ranks as the worst, and London, Tokyo, and Paris, respectively, as the best. So I thought you would like to know that in this study, London was named as the, sorry, let's stay there. London was named as the best city, buoyed by Britain's free and universal national health service, as well as it came top on economic opportunities. I'm suspecting some people may not agree. We can talk about that later. So today, I want to focus on the elisions in these popular numbers and representations. And partly this comes about because every week somebody writes to me to send them some of my research saying, I want to see how bad things are in India. And I think that often goes back to this kind of number and representation, but we want to think about all that. I mean, I'm just indicating a few things of the things that we cannot tell when we tell that narrative. So, you know, in a recent introduction, the volume on violence studies, Kalpana Kanabiran asks how we demarcate this field of violence in social theory. She says, how do we understand the norm and the normative in relation to violence? And so this is an exploration of that. So if we think of gender-based violence not as a stern hunt against a few bad actors, nor as the primary driver of patriarchy, but rather as embedded in intersectional structural vulnerabilities in the ways that Manali was just talking about, and regulated through governmentalities that amplify these forms of privilege, then we can talk about why the call for solutions like sterner laws or death penalty, or the drive to sweep up sex workers and runaways as anti-trafficking victims make us doubt those modes, right? So they make us lean into this wrong-headed patriarchal logic of violence. So I'm going to leave you with Kleinman's quote as a way of thinking about violence in its multiple and mundane forms. A second to read this. And so let me start with Delhi as this rape capital in popular parlance. You know, those of us who have lived or worked in Delhi might not particularly disagree, but let's look at the representational stakes of this kind of spectacular rhetoric, to use Wendy Hesford's phrase. All too often, this 2012 rape and murder of Jyoti Singh, too ironically called Nirbhaya by the press, it's cited as an archetypal example connecting gender-based violence and urban transformation, right? And it's often linked to other cases like the Shakti Mills case in Bombay, which was a journalist, a veterinarian on a scooter in Hyderabad last year. So all of these feature young women in the most quotidian of urban activities, going to a movie, following an assignment, getting home from work. They feature rapists from, they feature rapists from marginal urban communities, inappropriately modern in their drunkenness, out of control in homosocial group glee. So though there will inevitably be some kind of, you know, eye roll deserving reaction about women leaving the house in response, you know, the chief minister of my state, Mamata Banerjee, famously said, chow mein is, you know, chow mein and women getting, hetero couples getting together is the problem. But these cases also spur feminist communities to urge better laws. I mean, they become a way that we organize around them, right? So some of the effects are that feminist communities urge better laws, and they also generate fear from those who are similarly at work or out in the city, meaning that all the people who came out to all the protests were very genuinely personally affected by it. And it results in a lot of increased surveillance from their families. So what I'm going to do today is name 4 frameworks with some subsections through which to understand these cases. So first, the first I entitle Rape Capital, Love Capital. So that this This graphic is kind of hard to read, but these are, again, statistics from the Indian National Crime Records Bureau. They highlight 3 factors. One, a very large number of cases filed per year, 30 to 40,000. Second, a very low conviction rate. And C, a backlog of cases. So many cases are likely also underreported, right, given the high rate of acquaintance rape or caste and other power-based access. And the anti-feminist men's groups who have been studying recently regularly cite these numbers as examples of false or blackmail-related cases. But it's crucial to look at the nuances of social and economic contexts in which cases are filed and contexts in which convictions are lost. So I wanted to talk here about this, to me, the magnum opus, that is Pratiksha Bakshi's Public Secrets of Law. It's an ethnography of rape trials in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad. Falsity, we see, is constitutive of rape law. So police procedure, forensic investigation, scrutiny of testimony, and legal reasoning all operate through doubt about real rape, so ineffable moments in courts and corridors and labs and offices shape jurisprudence. You know, that in her example is the child who can't tell time but must meet the testimonial requirements of accounting for temporality, the woman who turns hostile witness to her own testimony, pressured by her natal and affinal families to forego the public allocation of her sexual violation. The psychologist who uses relaxation methods and audio stimuli to help rape accused fantasize and ejaculate in order to collect semen samples for evidence. And crucially, the ways that police delays, report writing techniques, and bureaucracy of certification vitiate the prosecution of Dalit rapes and atrocities and hate crimes. So proving a thing as atrocity and its difficulties. Journalist S. Rukmini some years ago tracked the data for rape cases in Delhi to find that 40% of cases were filed by parents who disapproved of marriage choice, right? Like they disapproved of caste or religious exogamy following elopement. So hence her quip that we should regard Delhi as the love capital. Another 25% were these promise to marry cases that I had looked at. So the point, of course, here is that such romances and alliances also index urban transformation and rural transformation, of course, but we need to name these contiguous forms of other kinds of patriarchal control of autonomy or marriage choice that you see in the rape statistics as being within the field of violence rather than deemed rape as the proxy problem. So my 1A is to talk about compromise as this concept. So briefly, criminal justice statistics say little about this fuller picture of legal pluralism, like Bakshi's work on the rape victim who turns hostile witness against herself. Many such compromise cases muddy the picture of guilt and compensation. We have to remember to think of compromise cases not as a case gone to waste, but as a space in which various pressures and needs are articulated. So the shadow of a criminal case often opens up a space to both pressure and cajole victims and families, especially people who are more marginalized, to accept monetary compensation. And they might assent to secure the only acknowledgement, however indirect, or the only foreseeable benefit, however small, or to forestall losing access to homes or education. But such cases get remembered as false charges for money and cast their lack of consent in doubt, inverting the vector, right? This MO has, of course, become quite familiar to us from the patented moves of Harvey Weinstein and his ilk. But we have lots of examples in South Asia. So there is this beautiful documentary called A Girl in the River about this 19-year-old girl in Pakistan. And my last monograph that Manali mentioned is also about how criminal domestic violence charges with an even higher rate of filing and an even lower rate of conviction are widely regarded as false claims rather than a rare strategic place to better negotiate the distribution of marital assets. Rupa Loza echoes my concerns about how such situations render the liberal concept of consent as tied to sex and bodily integrity moot, right? So she has a recent Science article about a Dalit woman whose account of rape didn't really match the murkier circumstances in which a deal was worked out for her. So reading from Rupal's piece, she says, Vinita is either framed as morally compromised by her illicit behavior or as a victim who is duped and coerced by upper caste connivance to enter into a relationship that is not of her choosing. The possibility for agency even the possibility to make bad sexual choices is unavailable. And I was reminded of an old article by Rajeshwari Sundararajan and Zakia Pathak on Shabano and her erased subjectivity in all the debates around Muslim women and law. Second, I entitled this the usual suspects. Leslie Adman's documentary, raised our hackles because it reiterated this military style of India's nadir of patriarchal relations trope. It erased the decades of work of the Indian women's movement on these issues. But it captured a common media trope in India that rapes are committed by men in the urban underclass in revenge against women's modernized sexuality. Images like that tell us whom to really be afraid of, what spaces to consider dangerous. So I want to draw our attention here to the ways in which this trope of gendered vulnerability comes to constitute caste and class privilege in the ways that Manali already said. So Sneha Annavarapu, for example, in this beautiful little paper, talked to male drivers and female passengers of ride-sharing apps in Hyderabad about their notions of risk. So here, drivers showed annoyance at drunk women, that they take up too much space, they vomit, they misbehave with their partner. She says, most importantly, they complained about how women use their status as women to escape any responsibility or accountability without considering how they were exploiting the labor of cab drivers. Women often frame their worries in the broader context of recurring rapes in the country, as well as a general feeling of class anxiety that became a function of lack of education, illiteracy, or a vulgar mentality that they placed upon the cab drivers, right? Note that the image of rape culture produced in these representations elides home, school, and work as the primary sites of gender-based violence, and kind of bolsters the legal incredulity about gentlemen rapists, thereby consolidating class privilege. Shannon Phillips on this project has worked on this boys' locker room idea and the deeply violent culture of entitled boys, for example. So also, the cis hetero women's danger in public space comes to stand for the national crisis, right? While the violence faced by poor and uneducated urban trans women, like Kothi sex workers, to take one example, come not to be called danger at all. Third, we might think of, let's stay there for a second. I call this section We Too. It is not that the victims of gender-based violence have not been trying to be heard, or, the waves of Me Too are only one example. So like Kannabiran, we might start with Bhavari Devi, a rural social worker in Rajasthan who was gang raped as retaliation for her work on child marriage. Her rapists were never convicted, but her case forms the basis of sexual harassment law in India, thus has become most useful to urban and middle-class women in formal employment or education. Other histories of protest and solidarity have been written on bodies, like this naked march of women against army social powers that sort of stands famously before us. This was the image. So these folks went up to the cops saying, after Thangam Manorama was killed, they say, Indian army, rape us, we are all Manorama's mothers, kill us, rape us, flesh us, they said. And that evokes histories like the Kikuyu women's anti-colonial protests, for example. With these latest protests that we call by the global term Me Too, of course, it is all different things, as we've been seeing in lots of exciting new work. We can debate its lasting efficacy or its scope, but what Me Too reveals, I think, is a profound unhappiness with the rules of sex and harassment at work, and a recalibration of everyday power. So importantly, in India, it has also been a call out to class and caste impunity, even among feminists, and the ways that privilege operates, whether or not formal laws are broken, right? So for example, Drishudwati Bargi has written beautifully about how Dalit bodies are differently raced and sexualized in university settings, right? So this goes to the very, very intimate question of how our school and work and hence private lives come to be constituted, and how to transform business as usual beyond individual accusations and prosecutions. Fourth and finally, I am unimaginatively calling this imagined communities. So I want to pan out from urban transformation to think about how gender-based violence does the work or fortifying the violence of the state. In the case of India, this presently means Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, cousin to various global right-wing regimes, but with its own aggressive menu of land annexation, deployment of police and military, founded on the figure of the menacing Muslim man and demographic doom, whether from outside or within the country. It would take more than the scope of this talk to pursue the many ways in which gender discourses express this agenda. Sanjay Srivastava has some very illuminating things to say about this. But let me talk briefly about two relatively recent ones. One is this phenomenon called love jihad, or the term. The idea that Hindu women are being lured into marriage by Muslim men as a pretext for religious conversion. So a perfect meme that coalesces brotherly protection or patronage from Hindu men, casts doubt about modern women's dodgy choices, and solidifies patriarchal kinship and property while it furthers religious nationalism. And not to mention that, like Trump's fake votes, the category itself is rare. It violates the right to freedom of religion, the right to marry, it infantilizes adult consent. We might also remember the shell game, that two of the stories of, gang rapes and murders by upper caste powerful men that I started with comes from these very states, right? So we are sort of looking in a different direction. Or the body of case law in which Hindu husbands have converted to Islam in order to claim the ground of apostasy to get divorced from their Hindu wives, which some judges have recently cast aside. And finally, is the question of borders, right? In contrast to the hypervisibility of urban safety is the invisibility of border zones as conflict areas. In a recent issue of the Economic and Political Weekly on gender violence in Kashmir, Natasha Kaul and Athar Zia remind us that the state's work of annexation and domination on many fronts is achieved through the management of knowledge production. The focus of conversations on Kashmir remains directed on nationalism, religious difference, and militancy. So if we look, for example, at the impunity of, Esther Batul says in this issue, if we look at the impunity of rapes by the military, of everyday sexualized harassment, and of women that amplifies the threat of rape and sexual violence against cis and trans men through feminizing humiliation, as well as noticing practices of solidarity and resistance, then we recalibrate how we might want to understand the public and private dynamics of law and order, right? So I'm going to leave you with two frameworks then, or two folks who have really influenced me and or helped me in thinking about this. So Sharmila Rege, the Dalit scholar, asked for analysis that centers forms of material privilege, placing in her analysis, she places Dalit women's labor and sexual exploitation to theorize gender relations. So here, that's a intersectional framework with which we can think about class, gender, and religion and sexuality as well. Second, I've been working a lot in, or I've been sharing with my students, Joe Fischel's wonderful book called Screw Consent. So Joe Fischel's call to screw consent in favor of understanding the conditions through which sexuality is pathologized and transacted, and sexual subjectivity and autonomy is curtailed, right? So he says, in the real world, structured by sex inequality and regressive gender norms, we must much more deeply question the voluntariness of all alleged voluntary sex and the supreme transformative power we assign to consent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Srimati. There was so much there to pick up on. I will just hand it over to Pumla now, and then after she's finished speaking, we'll see, we can tie some themes together. We talk. So Pumla.
Good afternoon. I just want to start by thanking everybody who, thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation and to listen to other feminist work on gender-based violence across this big divides. So thank you very much to the lead researcher of the GendV program, her co-researchers, as well as the larger project members, as well as to Ellen and other associates for logistical support. I want to speak to some of the questions that are often proposed and that were also proposed as discussion points for today's exchange, and begin by offering a few preliminary thoughts on the relationship between gender-based violence and the larger socio-political context in which it takes place. Now, this question of thinking about context and the context or contexts of gender-based violence is a deceptively simple question, deceptively simple undertaking. But in my experience, one that we need to keep in mind throughout our attempts to understand and unmake gender-based violence. Context, as we know, is crucial for our ability and capacity to understand what we see, to make sense of it, and to devise strategies for its confrontation. So language, interpretative lenses, proximity, recognizability, which itself is always haunted, of course, by echo, by connection, by misreading. And methodology are always important when we're thinking about context, because context surfaces the tensions between what is evident, in other words, what is obvious, what is implied, what is emergent, and what is versus what is invisible, but coded into patterns and manifestations that we see. If we stand outside of this deliberately political way of seeing the world as intricately connected, there's no immediate, obvious reason, for example, apart from scholarly interest, itself a joyful, legitimate enterprise, why a South African-based feminist would be, why in reading, say, Latin American feminist historians of colonialism would illuminate something about how a crucial thread of South African rape culture was woven into the British responses to the Xhosa 100-year anti-colonial war in South Africa. There were insights about the development of the historic constructions of the South African rape crisis that would have been lost to me as someone who's deeply concerned as a scholar and as a feminist in the world with the particular manifestations of rape culture in South Africa that have dubbed it, that have seen the country dubbed often as the rape capital of the world. There were insights about this development and about the particular manifestations and amplifications and sites of rape culture and other forms of gender-based violence and the historic constructions of the South African and Namibian rape crisis that would have been lost to me had I not been a scholar of slavery who understood the centrality of sexual violence in the constructions of white supremacy. I say all of this merely to underscore what often appears simple when we say history matters, and rather to invite us to constantly ask, what does it mean to say history matters? When I wrote Rape in South African Nightmare, one of the arguments that came, or at least in the reception of that text, one of the receptions, one of the kind of assumptions about what it means to take history seriously, often framed itself as the assumption that to speak about the importance of understanding historical constructions of rape culture, of specific rape culture, while caring about rape culture as a global phenomenon, but also caring about the specific ways in which it is accented in specific locales, often misread as making excuses for specific kinds of older Black masculinities. Whereas in fact, two examples that illustrate the importance of always paying attention to the ways in which history matters and continues to intervene. And when history matters, of course, is thinking of context, not only as a history that is complete, not only thinking of a history as that which is background to the manifestations, but one which is encoded in the very logics and rationales through which we understand and speak about the rape crisis in South Africa and elsewhere. Two examples about the court system and rape, and also taken for granted assumptions about rape and war. So in much feminist work on rape and conflict, or rape and different kinds of war specifically, we assume often that rape, much of this literature proceeds as though the relationship between warfare and rape is an old inevitable one. What does it mean for locations that live under the specter of colonialism, to understand that while rape is always part of patriarchal societies, the specific coupling of warfare and rape is in fact part of, reveals a hidden pattern of colonial transformations of older patriarchies. So that what we are seeing and the specific forms of gender-based violence are encoded with this trace of an amalgam of different forms of gender-based violence, and how these forms of gender-based violence indigenized, implanted themselves in new locales. And these are important. These are questions that are important, not just as background, but for context shaping of the methodologies and questions and which traditions of thought to best make sense of what we see in front of us. Because we understand that patriarchal violence has certain logics that are evident in very different locales, and that sometimes resemble each other in ways that are not always immediately discernible. In a recent conversation with the South African artist and visual activist Zanele Moholi, they foregrounded the tension between being this person, Moholi the artist, being this person who's unapologetic about complexly rendering Black South African queer life, its vulnerabilities, its joys, its peculiarities, its worlds, on the one hand, and being a person who chooses to live in South Africa. And Moholi argues that this is a tension that only arises when they travel and are confronted specifically and exclusively in response to their work in the world, such as the current retrospective on at the Tate currently, and exclusively with questions about endemic rape in South Africa and hate crimes against Black lesbians. And so this too is context. So context is not simply, context is also the specific ways in which Moholi, for example, speaks about how not to render the place in her context, South Africa, as a monster place, as merely a monster place. So that context then inheres also in the languages that as feminists who do our work, in the languages that not only pervade and shape our own work, but the languages and the vocabularies that our work confronts as it moves from place to place. I think context is really important also because it is also about being able to recognize different ways, as Moholi starts, of speaking about and articulating feminist work, recognizing that some feminist articulations have traveled on the backs of the very hegemonies that were initially designed to take apart. So in many parts of the world, for example, part of the way in which traditions of feminist work, traditions of anti-gender-based violence work are erased or supplanted is through the recourse to the much easier circulating notions of kind of the various waves of feminism. So context is always entanglement. It is not just what the feminist researcher finds, but it is also what the feminist researcher brings and thinks she can immediately identify as the same as behavior from another place. It requires that we understand rape culture and the multiple ways of rape culture as institutional and institutionally sanctioned, including, for example, in the places that many of us occupy as second homes, the academy, and of course recognize that many of the assumptions, the underpinnings of gender-based violence are not simply attitudinal or occasional, but constitutive of many spaces in our societies that are not explicitly, ostensibly about gender-based violence, as we pay attention to patterns that lead us to where we are. If we want to unmake it, then, if we want to continue to unmake gender-based violence, it remains important for us in our different locations to continue to understand it as a language, and as a language, of course, that, like all languages, is multiply inflected, has multiple dialects, that although it is recognizable in different places, there are echoes in different places, that the dialects encode much about violence, but also about feminist strategies to unmake it. This, of course, allows us to interrogate what is missing or needs to be amplified in our strategies, to gender-based violence in South Africa and all over the world. In Rape a South African Nightmare, I pay attention, for example, to some of the specific ways in which historically this institutionalization of rape culture has occurred or been set up. And this includes in the legal system, which has historically set up, for example, Black women as unrapeable, a phenomenon which means something very different from what it appears to mean. So rendering the impossibility, historical record that makes it unlikely and sometimes impossible for men of different races to be convicted for the rape of Black women, in turn creates, not just in the legal system, but in the larger society for which, with which it interacts, this notion of Black women's unrapeability. And the importance then of being able to think about the construction of unrapeability in relation to the high levels of rape that occur in the country, and in fact in the construction of also then this crisis and this deadlock in many ways. Many people who are familiar with the South African rape crisis or rape pandemic will know, for example, that while the numbers and the articulation of what there is substantial amount of public information, scholarly work, research, and so on that speaks to the crisis of rape and of rape culture in South Africa. It is as difficult to find a rapist in South Africa as it is to find a white person who supported apartheid. So it is this kind of dual public consciousness then, which on the one hand, the constant disavowal of rape culture, constant claims to adherence and valorization of a gender equitable South Africa, alongside levels of violence that are quite stark. And part of the perpetuation of this crisis, of this paradox, as often named, lies in this incredibly South African, in many ways, incredibly post-apartheid South African and Namibian aversion to tending to history as context, history as more than background, and of course missing then in many instances the capacity and the ability to understand the specific ways in which institutions that we assume, rightly or wrongly, mostly wrongly, as part of undoing rape culture are in fact directly implicated in rape culture. And of course, it's important as we do so to pay attention to the varied ways in which gender is made and unmade in small places and exchanges in places that are not immediately hostile, that are not immediately recognizable as sites of gender-based violence, because we know this is how continua are made and unmade. I'm not going to talk about romance because my colleague before me has already spent some time talking about and a lot of her work is in this area. But romance, of course, an area that is very historically framed in the world. We a very specifically historic notion of romance now covers much of the world. And it encodes many ideas about relationships between seduction and coercion, between value and desirability, through blurring of consent, where the negotiation of consent becomes something and misnamed as around signaling availability and how this works against desires of desirability of work. So in the South African context, for example, the use extensively of discourses of culture and ideal African cultural pasts as ways to argue against consent, to argue against women's claims to occupying public spaces in a variety of ways. Just quickly, two kinds of examples that we see articulating themselves repeatedly in that context. So every few months, there is an explosion because some people, so a young woman who is deemed as improperly clad, showing too much skin, a short skirt or short shorts, or is hounded, attacked by a group of men. There is a huge outcry in the public media, but alongside this exists often a defense of this attack through allusion to culture, to an old African past or cultural discourse that is claimed and framed in the very contemporary moment. So it makes claims to history, but is a very contemporary articulation and manifestation and tool as a way of regulating public space, as a way of socializing women into submission, and also, of course, as a big part of perpetually rendering women out of place through the construction of fear that I've elsewhere called the female fear factory. Manali, in her introductory comments, spoke about how often South African women speak about feeling unsafe. And perhaps then, just as closing, because I see my time is up, I'll share a little bit about how I understand this notion of fear and how important the construction and the manufacture of female fear, what I sometimes call the female fear factory, functions. The female fear factory is as theatrical as it is spectacular. So it is exaggerated in performance in front, sometimes, usually, of an audience in that immediately recognizes it, because it is the audience itself is fluent in the machinations of a process that, in the machinations of rendering women out of place and illegitimate in public spaces, through routine public sexual harassment, which itself is then very often rendered as cultural. In the same way, I suppose that in similar ways that we can think about kind of courtly romance in previous eras in the European or in the English imagination, the construction of the properly heterosexual woman as one who is not easily attainable by the male suitor, as one that has to be pursued, is then also used in very similar ways, but couched in the South African context as cultural, in the argument that unwanted comments, unwanted attention in public places is an old African way of articulating appreciation, so that the anger or the fear then that are often the response of being harassed in public when read as woman and read as female, which functions here not just biologically, but as a social discursive construction, then works to exile women, Black women, predominantly in the South African context, to exile Black women from any claims of a legitimate African location and African past, renders them strange, them exile, and therefore occupies a space that undoes much of the purported and claimed commitment, collective commitment to undoing gender-based violence in the South African, in the contemporary South African and Namibian public sphere. Because of course we know that the threat of rape is an effective way to remind women that they are not safe, and that their bodies are not entirely theirs, and that public spaces are not theirs. It is an exercise in power that communicates that the man, usually creating fear, has power over the woman, who is the target of their attention. It also teaches women who witness it about their vulnerability, either through reminding them of their own previous fear, or showing them that it could happen to them next. It is an effective way to keep women in check, and often results in women curtailing their movement in a physical and psychological manner. And this applies, of course, not simply to walking down the street, but also how women occupy other public spaces, including public transport. I think I may be, how am I doing for time? Should I just stop?
Yes, I think we have about 30 minutes for questions, and I see there's a couple of questions already started. Could I just kick off with a very quick question for both Srimati and Pumla? And I want to thank you both for these sort of amazing array of insights. I don't think we have time to even get to all of the points you've made today, but a very quick question, which is something I alluded to in my earlier comments about the sort of paradox between what both of you have alluded to or talked about, and Pumla, particularly you did, with the kind of historical encoding of various forms of gendered violence into the present, and the way in which context matters in thinking that way. But at the same time, I'm thinking about sort of how much has changed over time as well. So how do we account for the raft of legislation, feminist movements, you know, increase in the discourse of rights and the ubiquity of discourse about rape itself? How do we account for that and account for this perpetuation of this historical encoding into the present? It's a big question, but maybe a quick answer from you. And I don't know whether you want to use the word backlash at all, how you feel about that word. Thank you. Pumla or Srimati?
That is a big question. And I see someone else has actually also asked about how human rights frameworks are useful in that. Right? We could really go down this rabbit hole kind of law. And I try to restrain myself from not talking about law too much, but you could see, right, in the ways that I love the feminist fear factory words. But the law becomes the language of negotiation, right? And so I think we could also think of human rights framework in those ways, that they provide a useful language through which to negotiate, but that we have constantly to keep in mind all the things that fall out of that formulation, right? So both sides of it, there are ways in which those cases and the use of those frameworks help particular people achieve particular things, give them space, make it, to use Pamela's metaphor, make it a language in the world, but that also they are severely limiting. And just one example, for example, is this kind of the trafficking language, continuing war around the question of trafficking, and how then we are to think of sex work. We have to think of all the reasons that that women's engagement in sex gets caught in that framework of trafficking.
That's great. Thank you, Srimati. I think also, there's a South African feminist, former guerrilla politician, activist, Tenju Mtinso does in fact use the language of backlash. And her argument often has been that in countries like South Africa and Namibia, where the legislation, where there's this big disjuncture between the legislation and explosive levels of violence. Yes, we have to think about the histories that led to that violence and the normalization, but we also have to ask questions as feminists about whether, in fact, the explosions of gender violence, especially that kind of polices women in public spaces, isn't in fact a response to some of the successes in legislation or in visible kind of women's seniority in a variety of places. And then just very quickly, I mean, I think that of course one of the things that we know is that in the South African context and in many contexts where much of our legal system is a hybrid of colonial and different, is that the legal system is in fact implicated in the creation of the violence that we are seeing. So it's wonderful that you have this kind of rights legal work that seeks to undo it, but it often does so in a way that seems almost evasive of the history of the implication of the legal system in the very system. I don't know if I'm, so very often human rights frameworks are framed as though the big elephant in the room is not also the law and the legal systems themselves, through very often kind of notions of kind of repeal and reform, rather than perhaps the invitation that many feminists outside the legal profession also invite, which is to interrogate the very institutionality of kind of patriarchy within the law. But
and the state. Yeah, no, thank you, Pumla. That's very helpful. There are just a few questions pouring in now, and this is for you, Pumla, actually, because so from Paula Meth, she says, Srimati talked about how leadership, political ideology in India, Hindutva, has shaped GBV, gender-based violence. And for Pumla, has the leadership change in South Africa from Zuma to Ramaphosa shaped in any way? Would you care to comment quickly on that? Or in general, perhaps on the leadership? I mean,
I think that, well, I think that one of the interesting things about this particular moment, my short answer is no. However, I think that my no is slightly out of keeping with the general sentiment in the country. So this is why I'm explaining it. So I mean, I don't think there's been a significant shift. There certainly is a public perception that the shift from Zuma is to Ramaphosa, who's a much more receptive president to women's demands. And certainly there is a performance of that. He's at the same time, though, the performance has not really, beyond kind of listening and accepting invitations to speak and to listen and petitions and to making commitments, there hasn't really been a significant shift in the treatment of any aspect of gender-based violence or calls to state anything between the two administrations. So no, I certainly would be. And also, of course, it's very important for us to remember that Ramaphosa is not a break from the Zuma tradition, that he was Zuma's deputy and comes, in fact, from the very tradition, even if he himself may not be in the same exact tradition as an individual. But we're talking about him as a
Thanks. Pumla, you actually just muted yourself. I don't know whether you know that, but we caught the last bit. Thank you very much. I want to just bring a slightly different angle here, and this is from Nandini Gupta, one of our co-investigators, and she says the starting point of our project is to eschew the idea that gendered violence is perpetrated by the great unwashed. We also focus on the middle and upper classes, the gentleman rapists, as you put it. And we're really interested in endemic or implicit violence, coercive control within the middle and upper classes and castes, rather than just overt violence. So that's one very important aspect of how we actually seek to define gendered violence itself. So we are trying to locate and contextualize such violence in urban transformation that has brought about profound changes in gender roles. Do you have any thoughts how we might analytically explore these linkages? Again, if you could just give us a quick snapshot of your thoughts on that.
Hi, Nandini. So I think, I mean, that's the question, right? So methodologically, obviously because of the focus on the so-called great unwashed, we have constant, going back to crime statistics, right? For example, to see who is doing what, or to look at case law, just kind of reifies that process over and over again, right? So, I mean, one of the things that I had done, for example, is to look at courts to see who brings what kinds of cases to court and do that. So that's one way, but, Sanjay has very nicely looked at all kinds of discourses in everyday life, right? Processes of education, processes of media. I am constantly struck by, in the context of India at the moment, for example, how this conversation on borders and citizenship around the Citizenship Amendment Act or around Kashmir are also processes of forging certain forms of masculinity, right? So I do think methodologically we could look at I don't know, conversations around those topics, or Shannon's work on, sort of boys and how they talk about culture. It's a very entitled Boys and how they talk about culture is another entrance to that. Just one quick thing to say is that, so I've been looking right now at these anti-feminist men's groups and how they are dealing in this field of law and gender. And I'm constantly struck by, I also don't know how to tap into it, but I can just kind of ethnographically note that I'm constantly struck by the kind of, the penumbra of consent around from which these things draw, right? Of the over modern feminist, of too many rights, of, who is unrapeable, etc. So.
Pumla, did you want to comment on that? Particularly sort of you're bringing in the middle classes.
I mean, I think it's very important. I think Srimati has done such a great job that I'll just add one quick thing. I mean, I think one of the possible ways, I'm part of a ministerial task team on sexual violence at South African universities, and one of the things that strikes many and the people on it are mostly academic. Well, I think all academics. And one of the things that's kind of striking, of course, is that challenges this idea of gender-based violence perpetuators as the great unwashed, of course, is that when we pay attention to the patterns and the justifications of gender-based violence at universities, and how the very logic of gender-based, the ways in which the logic of gender-based violence is interwoven even into the history of certain kind of disciplines. And so, what does it mean to think about the professors as the perpetrators of sexual violence, actual sexual violence in the way that we see it, but also in other ways. And I've also, of course, just kind of been reading this wonderful book, Femicide in South Africa by Nechama Brody, and she spends the bulk of her time, in fact, looking at the rates of femicide by middle-class men, white and black, across over 40 years, and the very different ways in which they enter publicness, whether media or legal or kind of legal systems. So I think that some of that work is beginning to be done, and so in multiple places, in different places, maybe not multiple.
Thank you. So there are a couple of questions here really about responses by this. So one is on education. What can we, can the education curriculum play a role in addressing gender-based violence? And because one of the things we are doing in this project is working on some children's textbooks in the India context. So we're also very interested in that question ourselves. So any thoughts, Srimati? Would you like to take that question first?
Yes, I was very excited to see that question.
Yeah,
one of the things I am getting a reprieve from while I'm over here is to attend this training on our hearing and assault cases around gender-based violence. So we've been talking about this. And I mean, that is partly why I ended on this question on consent, because it seems to me that, that our education needs to be the things that we do in education. And I think schools are a whole other different issue that we could have a really good conversation about. But in university curricula, especially in the US, and I notice also in trainings in India sometimes, a lot of the focus is on this reified idea of consent, right? Persian Khan is his last name, have this study. It's called Sexual Science, this new book. It's so good, and I had such a good time discussing it with my students, because you can see that that is true. You ask a classroom of students what consent means to them, and there are as many definitions and as many elisions and individual negotiations as there are people over there. So, Partners in Law and Development in India and various Paramita Vora, for example, have done these very beautiful, like little short films, short conversations on how we all are actively negotiating what that should mean. And so, I want to make a plug for us not to just focus on consent as the grand thing. One of my students said last semester, like, When we are in high school, they keep saying to us, don't get pregnant, don't get pregnant. And then you arrive in college and they're like, affirmative consent, with never any further conversation about that. Pumla, what do you think?
Pamela, any thoughts? Yeah, I'm just trying to get a sense of the sort of comparative dimensions here. What would this look like? So I have a question here from Ilaria. Pamela, it's for you, if that's okay. You mentioned the importance of considering colonial history and colonial violence in thinking about sexual violence and conflict. Would you be able to elaborate on that and whether that lens could be applied to other forms of gender-based violence and conflict, not just sexual violence?
Thank you, Lara. Yes, I think not just in terms of kind of sexual violence either, but just also in terms of appropriate responses and appropriate sexualities. So I think that in terms of kind of the colonial histories, the whole it's a minefield. I've talked about kind of colonial warfare a little bit, but I think, for example, if we think about the ways in which kind of the disciplined and discourses of discipline and hygiene have been used in colonial, in very kind of specific ways in colonization in different parts of the world, and specifically in kind of, well, in all parts of the world that have been colonized. But if you think about the construction of the disciplined, of the civilized, very often codifies ideas of a worked on body in very kind of troublesome, contained ways, but also, of course, is often codified as structured as the appropriate response to sexual violence, right? So so the appropriate, so I'm thinking, for example, in your context, Iliara, I think you said you're working on Uganda. Yeah. I'm thinking of, for example, the way in which a troublesome or unruly woman, like someone like Stella Nyanzi, is disciplined in the public imagination, right? So the disciplining is around, well, I mean, this absolute shock and horror that this middle class a PhD woman is in fact making claims is behaving in these rude ways, is speaking of sexual desire in public, is speaking of queer desire in public. So I think that the discourses of gender-based violence and coloniality intersect in the obvious ways, but they also intersect in things that seem to be about something entirely different, and in how they in fact close down our ability or preclude the ability to speak about the shame that comes with gender-based violence, right? Through in fact the performance of civility and the disciplined and the properly the unrude woman, right? So we're speaking, where articulation of any kind of madness is that unruly woman then becomes part of this rude tradition that has no place, that renders any claims made on its basis as automatically illegitimate. But where does that discourse of it often paraded in the East African sense through hygiene, right? But where does this idea of the disciplined body, of the appropriately located body come from? It comes in great part not just from the civilizing mission as abstract, but also from a denial and a hiding of the pervasive violence that was being enacted in very sexualized and embodied ways on the body of the colonial. I hope that goes some way to answering what you wanted to know about Iliara, or my thoughts.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. I wanted to just pick up, perhaps as we sort of towards the conclusion of this wonderful webinar, but just to pick up on a question that Srila wanted to bring us back to thinking about, which is to sort of reflect on where women's and feminist movements are now, and sort of what we might see as some of the similarities and differences between South Africa and India, and kind of connected to my earlier question about I know the word neoliberalism is problematic in hundreds of ways, and we all know that, but I think that moment, shall we say that moment, because we do want to think historically, has it interrupted or absorbed the capacity of feminist movements, or its aspects, because there are no such thing as the homogeneous feminist movement, aspects of the feminist movement to really take this question on in a way that would actually help move the question forward. So I don't know whether Srimati, you want to just make some general comments.
Hi, Srila. Was the question about feminist organizing, and did you want it to be about neoliberalism? Is that what?
No, I'm adding to Sheila's question. I hope Sheila doesn't mind. Sorry, I just want us to kind of think about that moment, sort of thinking about the term neoliberal feminism, for example, the number of different ways in which, you know, and we're finding this is something I mentioned as well, you know, the ways in which the circulation of feminist discourse can go hand in hand with the continuity of patriarchal assumptions among women. We're not talking about men's rights movements and backlash, but actually how women appropriate these languages themselves, or how they understand feminism.
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, again, we could spend so much time talking about that. Hi, Srila. I've been thinking constantly about her work and thinking about South Africa and India together. I think, you know, I often think about the question of what constitutes neoliberalism in feminism, how our students, for example, come to understand what, you know, what are the discourses through which they hear it, and how they come to understand all of these issues, right? So I think I actually will turn this over to think about Srila's recent work, right? That so she looks at the dynamics of different feminist organizations. So we don't, I mean, some of the very interesting ethnographic work is to see how, not just at the level of, you know, like big organizations who are going for big funds, or how people are inflected by media discourses, but how individual subjectivities are shaped through, you know, like making a living for yourself, being a person out in the world, versus you know, all the evils that we attribute to neoliberalism. And that's the seduction of it, right? Is how you are also shaping your comportment and your behavior through all of that. Yeah, I see Pumla.
Absolutely, Srimati. Sorry, I'm like nodding so hard. I think that the individualization also of kind of feminism. So, you know, we see it in the empowerment, the women's empowerment discourse, right? Which isn't necessarily about transforming the workplace, transforming the economy. It's about ensuring that you have as many women CEOs as possible, which is all well and good. But much of that discourse then is about individual achievement, and it's also, of course, about the individual woman taking on the work, so kind of leaning in. Rather than transforming, and rather than more kind of institutional understandings of and of course, one of the things that that is striking me increasingly is the way in which the old feminist principle of choice is also kind of increasingly being pulled into ideas around performances of individual women's subjectivities in ways that are troubling. So, for example, we see, I think we see it in many places, but we see it in South Africa quite a lot. Often that sometimes the claim to feminism is sometimes embodied by someone doing something, performing quite violent, seemingly anti-feminist performances, which are then defended as, yes, but it is, I mean, feminism is about choice, right? And so individuals, so people, it's a claim to feminism. It's performing something that historically appears hostile to feminism, but it's being defended through again, because it's individual notion of, well, I mean, if I choose to be objectified, it's a feminist principle. So you know, and I think it's this kind of idea of again, it's this notion of the individual. So the advancement is about the individual. the claim to feminism is always about is it in this context is a claim that roots in the individual and doesn't travel beyond that, right? And so it's almost like a perversion, I think, of the personal is political, and it just becomes the political is individual, the private is political.
Yeah, I like that inversion. That's really interesting. I think we're going to really take just a couple more questions, and just very quickly, I know Margaret Abram, who's also on our advisory board, I just want to take her question about funding, whether you have a question, whether, you know, funding, how does funding shape the framing of gender-based violence? And of course, one of the things that our starting point was really to look at the big data approach and the approach around GBV, which is around certain kinds of, you know, correlations, and the funding pours into certain kinds of studies. So if you could make a comment on that, if anybody, either of you wants to, you don't both have to say anything if you don't want to.
Yeah, hi, Margaret. So it's so great to see her pop up on that. I'm just going to say very briefly that, you know, of course that is true, right? In a place where a sort of global trends in what comes to constitute feminism so much shapes the work of so many grassroots organizations. And I think just in the case of India, I would say, certainly from a couple of years ago, two of the, I mean, you know, let's set aside COVID year, but so trafficking or whatever falls under that, and then mass health, you know, men's health has come to constitute like such a big piece of the funding that everything has to be framed in those terms, right? Or many organizations who do all kinds of other unrelated work have framed themselves in those terms. So I mean, that's a question, right? Like, what's the role global feminism plays? How are those things constituted, right? If Gloria Steinem is showing up to talk about a particular issue, you know, how is that going to shift the balance of what takes place versus what are organizations actually looking for in their communities? Can I just say very quickly, Pumla, I saw someone said, you know, mothers should take this forward in the home. Yeah. I will have to disagree that actually, I mean, not just that all parents should take it on in their homes, but that actually it's between media, political discourse, school, you know, other forms of civil society that we have to have all those conversations. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Yeah, Pumla?
Can I just pick it just one sentence? I keep saying one sentence. Absolutely, Srimati. I mean, I think that on the mother issue, I mean, this is something, South Africa has a very high percentage of single parent, the vast majority of which are women families, women-only families. And I don't mean in partnership, I mean a single mother as the primary caretaker, and sometimes only caretaker. And very often in the argument that feminists are met with is, yes, but how can we have such violence, such toxic masculinities in this country? It's the women who are responsible because it's the women who are raising. If you're not raising your sons in this way, yes, of course there's responsibility. But of course, we know that parents, mothers, even feminist mothers, are not the only people raising their children. That in fact, a big part of feminist parenting is not just socializing your child, but also unteaching your child many of the patriarchal, kind of patriarchal violent messages and socialization that they get elsewhere. And so I appreciate you pushing back against that, Srimati. And I, you know, it's an endless kind of retort in South Africa. Well, most parents are mothers, so it's mother's fault. So women need to fix gender-based, the South African rape culture, and you know, it doesn't work like that.
Sure, and the similar arguments are made in the US around gang affiliations and violence. So it does come back to the mother, and the single mother is this, talk about fear factor, very interesting. I think that basically there are a number of comments here and questions. I think you probably rounded up quite well with your discussions around what next and what is to be done. Any closing comments? We've only got a minute or two. Is there anything you would like to say to sort of sum up what you really want to put out there? I think a lot of questions about what can be done, where do we go from here, kind of thing.
I'm not going to answer where do we go to from here. I'm going to end on a slightly different note. And I mean, I thank you very much for, I've had a wonderful time on this conversation, this platform. And I have particularly appreciated, I think something that we, you know, an old-fashioned, I'm an old-fashioned feminist, the specific ways in which we're speaking across very different places and you know, and I suppose I have a romantic attachment to an internationalist feminist conversation. So just to say thank you for that, and Srimati, I've just loved listening to you, and thank you everybody for coming, and Manali, thank you so much to you especially, and to your team. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. Yes, I hope to work with you all again. So I'm not going to
Absolutely. I think that's a great invitation, and we'll pick up on it. Thank you. And Srimati, anything closing comments?
I too just wanted to say, I feel like, you know, I'm just hearing Pumla and thinking I need to talk to you both for at least a few more hours. So happen in some way, but I don't know where to go from here. We are always like this, you know, in our, like, it's all intersectionality. We should look at everything and every action, act on all fronts, right? Which is true and depressing. So so I'm really excited to hear more about the project too, and how, you know, I'm excited to see that you are both looking at kind of discourse in several different ways, but you're also looking at artistic production and how that goes forward. And so that's what I wanted to urge us to do in terms of where do we go from here, is that we do our, you know, our vigilance is to notice how this discourse is produced and what we do with it. So
thank you both so much. It was just the most illuminating discussion, and I could see from the comments everybody's really, you know, there are lots of really great and thankful comments. Just to say to everybody here that this is the first of a number of public events that we will be holding. So please look out for updates from us, and carry on, you know, following us on Instagram and Twitter, and check out our website, which has been dropped into the chat box. And thank you all for listening and joining us today. It was just a great honor to listen to Pumla and Srimati. And take care, both of you, and look forward to talking more. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.